I know a lot about birds and bees, but I don't know very much about the birds and the bees. Jonathan Safran Foer. Now, I was deciding whether to be candid with you guys and make it seem like everything is fine and dandy, but this is the third time that I am recording this episode because we had many technical difficulties, but I am still just as excited to talk about it. And I really love this quote because I don't know how much truer this quote can be. There's so many people who just don't know enough about sex as they should. And quite frankly, the state of sex education in too many situations is just not up to par. And I also know that many people will probably be a bit shocked by my choice to discuss this today because it's definitely outside of my topic niche, my well known, you know, topic of conversation, which is usually either in social justice or sustainability. And this is a bit out of my box. But even though I risk offending some people, I did agree with myself when I started this podcast that I was going to talk about issues that I find important and that should be publicized. So here we are. Deal with it. So I think everyone should be aware of what the birds and the bees is, that term. And if you're not, it's essentially a term used to describe that coded conversation that adults, mainly parents, have with their kids to educate them on sex, intercourse, copulation, whatever you want to call it. And I do want to preface by saying that I am by no means an expert. I am not a child psychologist. I'm not a sex therapist by any means. So please take everything I have to say today with a grain of salt, and also note that I have decided to ground this conversation today in research, and I will leave access to the resources that I found so that you may take a look for yourselves as well. So, we already know that a basic level of sex education has been widely accepted formally in schools and different institutions because it's acknowledged that it's important to teach kids about sex, the biology of it, the reproductive cycle, where babies come from, all of that good stuff. And even though it is still a debated topic about when you should teach the kids about that, if it should be schools or parents teaching them, it has been proven that that education, that fundamental basic level of sex education is beneficial because it reduces the rate of child pregnancies, child STDs, and just generally kids getting into sexual situations that they may not be fully ready for or fully educated on. And whether you believe sex education is robbing kids of their youth or damaging them in any way, it has been proven that it's a good thing. But what I do understand and side with parents on is that parents should have the freedom to dictate when and how they give their kids that talk, the talk. In my opinion, once you're not causing your child to feel ashamed or embarrassed about sex or discussing it in a restrictive or harmful way, then it should be fine to give them that foundational, basic conversation on sex education in whatever way you see fit. But to be honest, that's not really what we're talking about today. That's not the focus of our conversation today. But I did want to mention that because what we are talking about today is advancing that basic level of sex education to a more secondary level, one that is not really as discussed as widely as it should be. Basically, understanding sex beyond the biological and reproductive cycle aspect of it and including conversations around pleasure, around the intimate parts of sex, around normalizing what sex is and should be like for both parties or however many parties there are. And also importantly, how this may be experienced differently for men and women or between non heterosexual couples. And the reason I say that this is so necessary for it to be happening between family members, amongst friends, and also in official education systems is because inevitably, when you get to the teen and tween stage, which is when I think these conversations need to be had more, you are inevitably exposed to narratives on sex, sexual innuendos, whether it's from TV shows, social media, overhearing conversations from adults, or having inquisitive conversations amongst friends in school. You're going to be exposed to it. Your kids are going to be exposed to it, and you yourself will be exposed to it at some stage in life. And the way you are exposed to it is a very important thing that needs to be addressed. Because the thing is, sexual sources like porn has become the world's leading educator on what sex should be and what sex should look like and how it should feel and all of those different things. And I don't think I need to tell anybody nowadays why that's so harmful. The conversation around the harmfulness of porn and the danger of porn has been discussed to death. And if you don't really know much about it, I really do encourage you to go research and look into the dangers of the perpetuation of porn and why that should not be the prime source of sexual education for not only just young people that but adults, everybody as a whole. The lack of that open and honest and truthful conversation around sex on a secondary level is the reason why we have so much misinformation surrounding sex and why so many negative stereotypes and negative sexual experiences are being perpetuated far beyond just teens and people in their 20s, but people all going into adulthood. And this isn't something that should continue to be overlooked. So I think it is very important to normalize having open and honest, candid conversations around the realities of sex on a secondary level in schools, between friends, and even amongst your family members as well. And I think the media is definitely working on doing this a little bit more now. For example, most, if not everybody, should be familiar with a show on Netflix called Big Mouth. Now, when I first was exposed to Big Mouth, my first initial reaction was shock. A good shock though. It's just kind of hits you like it's you don't expect a little cartoon show to be so raw and honest about the sexual experiences you have growing up or the sexual narratives you're exposed to growing up. And the thing about Big Mouth is they did that. They were very open and honest about that, and they have now normalized or are working to normalize open conversations surrounding sex beyond the basic level, but doing it in a really clever way by layering it with humor to make it more comfortable, a more comfortable conversation. And I love that because I'm also not afraid to talk about the fact that when I was starting to explore sex beyond a theoretical sense and more in a practical, real life sense, I did find myself on TikTok, on social media platforms, and on Google, just like researching, you know, be not just what is sex, but like the emotional side of sex and the relationships between people having sex, if you get what I mean, and what should be expected, what I should and shouldn't do, and all of those different things. I think most people look up all of those different questions that you have that aren't really discussed in a formal sense. And even when you're having informal conversations between friends or overhearing adult conversations, it is based on a lot of stereotypes and things that aren't true and things that are extreme, and it's just not helpful. It's more so harmful and clouds your image of what you should expect, what you should like and what you shouldn't like, and what's weird and what's cool and what's everything, you know? And it also, well, there's this now glorification of sex being an accomplishment. And that's the other thing that I wanted to talk about as well. I think that we need to start normalizing it being okay to delay sex if you don't want to be having sex right now. Because what we now have in society, or maybe we've had it forever, I really don't know. But what I know is that it's there, is that sex really isn't truly seen as an accomplishment. So there's now this notion of when you should have your first time and how often you should be having sex. When is it too long to have gone without sex? You know, all of these things, oh, like your body count, all of these things, it's crazy to me that this is normalized and it's glorified as cool. And I think we need to be letting teens and everybody really know that it's absolutely okay if you have not had sex yet, or if you're not having it as much as other people around you, or if you're not even interested in having it. You don't need to feel pressured into having sex because it feels like the norm or the cool hip thing that you should be doing. Now, the conversation of sex has always and probably always will be a hot topic. It always has been the cool topic to talk about, which what I'm emphasizing is that it's being talked about in a harmful way, which is what we need to change. But it always will be a topic of interest because of how intimate sex is. And it's always been a curious topic that will garner attention. But this glorification of sex being an accomplishment can definitely be very harmful for people in that it can make them feel as though they haven't they have to be doing it or else it's embarrassing that they're not. So that glorification is really just one example of the ways in which our conversations that we have around sex can needs to be changed. There's so many other examples as well, but when I was thinking about what is the way we need to change it, what is the new conversation around sex that we need to have that should be normalized, and important topics to focus when we talk about normalizing and shifting the conversation, I think the number one thing that needs to be prioritized would, of course, be consent. And I know that that has been a topic that has come to the fore a lot more, especially in the media and especially around young people, which is something I'm really grateful for because we're now understanding the importance of consent, the different forms of consent, and also the bounds of consent because nobody should, once again, feel pressured or pressure someone into having sex. And it's also important for us to understand the ways in which we might be doing so. We might be getting pressured or pressuring someone else into doing so unknowingly. And what should we do if we feel pressured? How do we ask for consent? All of those things have now become a very mainstream conversation, which is really good. But beyond that, I think pleasure needs to be talked about a lot more. And I don't think it is talked about nearly enough, at least not in a healthy sense. And I think the reason for that is because the conversation around sexual pleasure is really clouded by a lot of misguided and just misinformation as a whole. And I think probably anybody that has had conversations surrounding sexual pleasure can think of different examples of things that they have been told that might not really be true when you talk about providing sexual pleasure for girls or providing sexual pleasure for guys or vice versa, whichever. It has a lot of misinformation. There has a lot of misinformation out there, and I think when we're talking about giving teens and young people that secondary level of education on sex, it should be prioritized to let them know what pleasure is and the importance of focusing on pleasure for both parties and how diverse pleasure can be. Because if we overlook that topic, then it can result and has resulted in the experience and the idea of sex being tainted for so many people who go into sexual experiences with this misinformation and then have terrible experiences, and it clouds the way that they view sex completely. And one of the things that is just honestly not understood as much as it should be is that sex and pleasure are not two inextricably linked concepts. Quite frankly, a lot of the time they are separate. And for them to be linked, for them to go hand in hand, it definitely requires open communication. It requires respect, appreciation for one another. And this doesn't only have to apply to a long term romantic relationship, it can also apply to just a hookup, a casual sexual encounter, whether it's a friends with benefits or whatever situation that you may have. Those factors, that open communication, that respect, that appreciation for each other, is still required for you to have pleasure be linked to your sexual experience. And one thing I've heard a lot when researching and discussing this topic with other people is the importance of exploring self-pleasure as well. Because the thing is, you can't really advocate for what you like if you don't already know what you like. It's like, going out and shopping, right? If you go on like a little, if you go to the mall and you go shopping for a dress or an outfit of any kind, you're not going to really know what to look for if you haven't figured out what your style is. If you haven't maybe looked online or looked at other people to see, oh, I actually like what that looks like and that kind of thing. I like that on me. You're going to kind of go in and just kind of try everything and probably get a little disappointed because there's so many different options and now none of them are working for you and you don't even know what you want, and then it's just like, ugh, why am I even doing this? The same thing applies to sex. By the way, even though I'm not I'm not uncomfortable talking about this topic, I do deeply hope that none of my parents or authority figures are listening to this episode, because even though I'm not ashamed, it's still weird. It's still weird to think about whether they're listening or not. But anyway, we push on. So yeah, I think it's really important to not stigmatize the idea of self-pleasure and actually encourage it when we're talking about exploring and prioritizing pleasure. Actually, a really good show that I do recommend everybody watch, not just girls, everybody watch at least once in your life is The Principles of Pleasure on Netflix. Super educational, super open, honest, and really explores sexual pleasure in a way that is not talked about. And this is what I'm talking about. That show fully embodies the conversation that I'm trying to express today, where we're shifting the conversation of sex to be more non stereotypical, non negative conversation. And also, I think one of the very first steps to ensuring that is shifting the way that we talk about it, just on a fundamental basis, the words that we use, the terms that we use. Going back to the same title, the first thing we talked about, the birds and the bees. It's so much more beneficial when you're talking about sex, especially to younger people and to kids, to use the raw terms. Because whether you're talking to your friends, your partner, a parent to a child, using coded terms like the birds and the bees, or I don't know, like what are the other coded terms that people have for sex and like sexual stuff? I think a lot of people have coded terms for things like your period, oh, flow has come, all that stuff. All of that stuff that, your parents used to call periods and that kind of thing. All of those coded terms is only another way of making sex and natural processes feel like something to be embarrassed about or ashamed of, and it's just not. You need to normalize it being okay to have natural experiences and to feel natural things. And we can only do that if we talk about them honestly and openly. And let's say you're already at a point in your life where you have been clouded by a lot of misinformation already, which is probably the same boat that most younger adults or adults in general are right now. You've already been misguided about sex. And now you're on a sexual journey to figure out the truth and to figure out what's best for you. So you're looking to have those open conversation and that open communication with, say, your partner about your likes and dislikes, which is a really, really good first step. Now, if you feel like you can't have these conversations with your partner, and like I said, once again, I don't always mean a romantic partner. Yes, a romantic partner, but I'm also speaking for casual sexual hookups and stuff like that. If you feel like you cannot have this open conversation with them, or they're making you feel weird about it, then you really should sit down and reassess the dynamics of your relationship with them. And also assess whether you should still even be with them. Why are you with them? Or why are you engaging in this relationship with them if you don't feel like you can advocate for yourself and get what you want out of the relationship too? Maybe they aren't the best person to be with. Maybe you should feel comfortable enough to say, hey, I would really like if we tried this, or I'm actually not really into that. And the thing about it is, so many, both women and men, feel scared to say what they like or what they don't like because they're scared that it may be a turnoff, or they might seem abnormal, or if they don't want to do this, then are they really even like good at sex? There's so many different like narratives that are stuck in people's head because of the harmful conversations that we've had throughout our lives about sex that has now dictated the ways in which we act in our own private sexual endeavors. So you should feel like you have the right to advocate for what you want. Because fundamentally, it's also about respecting yourself enough to stand up for what you want and what you don't want. Because if you don't respect your own wants and needs, how are you expecting them to respect yours? I know that was a bit of a mouthful, but I will say it again slowly so that you understand. If you don't respect your own needs, your own wants and dislikes, and to advocate for those, then how on earth are you going to expect them to respect your wants and dislikes? It starts with you. Now, please also note that there are many other resources beyond the ones that I've attached that discuss sex education, normalizing open conversations around sex, and addressing issues that we haven't even talked about today, like sexual coercion, sexual violence, when the experience of sex gets really bad. This whole conversation around sex education is a very, very, very extensive topic, and I really only scratched the surface of it, and I have not gone into many other subtopics that could emerge. So please feel free to do your own research and share feedback with me on other topics that might interest you to discuss, and I will look into discussing those as well, because I think that this is a very important conversation, even though it may make some people uncomfortable, even though it may seem like a vulgar topic or something like that. I don't think that it should be one of those conversations you should stuff into a drawer or shove to the back of your closet. I think this should be an open and honest conversation that we need to normalize more, because it is a very real aspect of life. And if we cannot talk about the things that are happening in everyday life, then what's the point of having conversations at all? What's the point of society? The first step to transforming conversations like this one is educating yourself, and then also introducing conversations like this with people you trust. So I have now created an environment, or been encouraged to create an environment, because I honestly have learned a lot from the people around me as well. But I am now in an environment where I feel super comfortable talking to my friends, family members, not all family members. I wouldn't go talk to my great grandmother about the different types of sexual pleasure. I I feel comfortable talking to some family members, just people that I'm very, very, very close to, about these open and honest conversations. I I can have such open, easy conversations with friends that I have, because we have now come to a point where we no longer feel ashamed to talk about things that we already know happen. I can feel very comfortable to talk about the fact that we have periods with guys, for example. And that is one thing that definitely was not talked about back in the day, and something that even my mom gets a little surprised that I would mention that to my guy friends or whatever. And they're not fazed by it, because we have now begun to transform very natural processes and natural conversations to a place where it's a more open and honest conversation. And I think we need to do that more with sex, so that it's no longer a conversation that is clouded in misinformation and harm, and where sources like porn are the main educator for young boys and girls. And also advocating for sexual experiences that are not so stuck in a box, beyond the heterosexual experience, but also to include sexual experiences of the LGBTQI plus community, because that's also an area that's definitely overlooked way too much. And a lot of people who are in that community tend to find themselves online searching for things, or asking questions to maybe the wrong people, or just doing it by going out and learning for themselves, which is, it is a really tricky situation, because I don't think I need to explain to anybody why that can be so harmful. So making sure that we have the official channels to actually have these conversations, whether it be in school when you hit a certain age, or normalizing it so that it is very open communication and conversations with friends that are not clouded in stereotypes, among family members, like I said. So now I am rambling. So I am going to end this episode and let you guys know that I have once again attached resources for you to look at, the resources that I used to ground my education for this topic today, and also resources that you could look at to educate yourself. And as always, if you enjoyed this podcast, please do give it a follow, give it a rating, a review, whatever you want to do. And if you want to see more about the podcast or keep up to date with our episodes and what we're doing, please check out the socials on TikTok and Instagram at the Notes and Quotes Pod, on YouTube at the Notes and Quotes Podcast. And if you want more of me, you can check me out on Instagram at Naomi A. Cambridge. And as always, I love chatting with you guys. I love being able to discuss these controversial and very topical issues with you. So I'm very excited to do it again next week. And I will see you next Tuesday. Bye. Have a great day or night.